Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking a bit of a shortcut, really, to get you well informed on something absolutely fundamental in biology.
The blueprint of life itself.
Exactly, DNA and RNA. So our mission, if you will, is to pull out the core ideas from a chapter in Robert Brooker's Genetics, Analysis, and Principles.
The 7th edition, yeah.
Right. We're going to trace that amazing journey scientists took, figuring out what genetic material is, and then we'll break down the incredible structures of DNA and RNA.
It's quite a story.
It really is. We want you to have those aha moments, get the key info without feeling like you're drowning in details. We're diving right into the molecular heart of it all.
And what's really fascinating, I think, is just how far we've come. I mean, think about it from these really vague ideas about inheritance.
Like recipes being passed down, sort of?
Sort of, yeah. To the incredibly precise molecular models we have now. We'll trace that path from the early experiments right up to that iconic double helix.
It really shows the power of scientific inquiry, doesn't it?
Absolutely. A testament to curiosity.
Okay, so with that setup, let's tackle the big question first. What actually is the genetic material? Because, it wasn't always obvious. Not at all.
Right. Scientists knew something was carrying information, but chemically, what was it?
And whatever it was, it had to meet 4 really crucial criteria, didn't it? First, information. It has to hold all the instructions to build, well, everything. An entire organism.
All the blueprints.
Second, transmission. It needs to be passed down reliably, parent to offspring.
Makes sense. Got to pass it on.
Third, replication. Super important. It must be copied accurately every time a cell divides or for reproduction.
Faithfully copied.
Exactly. And finally, variation. It has to allow for differences, account for all the different traits we see within a species.
And if you think about it, those 4 criteria were like guideposts for the early researchers. Even before they knew what it was made of, they knew what it had to do.
Which brings us Griffith, right?
Yeah.
Frederick Griffith in 1928.
Spot on. He was working with Streptococcus pneumonia, the bacteria that causes pneumonia, and he had these 2 strains. A smooth S strain, which had this capsule and was deadly.
Virulent. Yeah.
And a rough R strain. No capsule, totally harmless.
Okay, so the mouse experiments. This is where it gets wild.
It really does. So live S bacteria. Mouse died. Predictable.
Right.
Live R bacteria. Mouse lived. Also expected.
Yeah.
Heat killed S bacteria. Mouse lived. Okay, heating killed the deadly ones.
Still makes sense. But then
Then the twist. He mixed live, harmless R bacteria with those heat-killed S bacteria.
the deadly ones.
Exactly. And the mouse died.
Whoa.
And not only that, when he examined the dead mouse, he found live, deadly S bacteria.
So something from the dead S bacteria actually changed the live R bacteria.
Precisely. He called it transformation. Some kind of transforming principle was passed from the dead S to the living R, turning them deadly. It clearly carried information and was replicated. Huge clue.
But still, what was that principle? DNA? Protein? Something else?
That was the million-dollar question. Which leads us to Avery, MacLeod, and McCarty in the 1940s. They picked up right where Griffith left off.
Their hypothesis was basically trying to identify that transforming principle, right?
Exactly. Was it DNA, RNA, protein, maybe carbohydrates? They took extracts from the deadly S bacteria and purified them, separating the different components.
And the key finding.
Only the purified DNA extract could transform the harmless R into the deadly S type.
Okay, that sounds pretty definitive.
It was strong, but they went further to really nail it down. They treated the DNA extract with different enzymes.
Ah, the enzyme tests.
Right. They used RNAs to destroy RNA, transformation still happened. They used proteins to destroy proteins, transformation still happened.
Meaning it wasn't RNA or protein?
Correct. But when they used DNase, an enzyme that destroys DNA.
Let me guess, no transformation.
You got it. The transforming ability was completely lost. This was incredibly powerful evidence pointing directly at DNA.
Wow. Okay, so after that, surely everyone accepted DNA was the stuff of genes. Or was there still some hesitation? You mentioned a blender experiment.
Yeah, you'd think that would be it, but some skepticism lingered. Proteins are complex, right? Lots of variety. Some scientists still favored them. So the final nail in the coffin, so to speak, came from Alfred Hershey and Martha Chase in 1952.
The blender experiment.
That's the one. They used bacteriophages, viruses that infect bacteria, T2 phage specifically.
And the genius part was that phages are simple, aren't they?
Deceptively simple, just a protein coat surrounding DNA. And crucially, when it infects, the protein coat stays outside the bacterium while the genetic material goes in.
Okay, so how did they track which part went in?
Radioisotopes.
Yeah.
Clever labeling. They grew one batch of phages with radioactive sulfur 35S, which labels proteins because sulfur is in amino acids but not DNA.
Got it. Sulfur for protein.
And another batch with radioactive phosphorus 32P, which labels DNA because phosphorus is in the DNA backbone but not really in phage protein.
Phosphorus for DNA.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Then they let these labeled phages infect E. coli, waited a bit for the injection to happen, and then the blender.
Literally just put them in a kitchen blender.
Pretty much. Just enough to shear off the phage coats clinging to the outside of the bacteria without bursting the bacteria themselves. Then they separated the bacteria from the liquid containing the empty coats.
And the results?
Crystal clear. Most of the 32P, the DNA label, was found inside the bacterial cells. Most of the 35S, the protein label, remained outside in the liquid with the phage coats.
So the DNA went in, the protein stayed out.
Bingo. It proved definitively that DNA carried the genetic instructions injected into the bacteria. That really sealed the deal for the scientific community.
Incredible. A really elegant experiment. So DNA confirmed as the genetic material for most life, though, as you said, some viruses use RNA, which is interesting in itself.
Yeah, a slight wrinkle, but for bacteria, archaea, eukaryotes, it's DNA.
All right, so we know what it is. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of how it's built. DNA and RNA, the nucleic acids. Call that because, well, found in the nucleus and acidic.
That's pretty much it. Found in the cell nucleus originally, and they have acidic properties due to the phosphate groups.
And understanding their structure, you mentioned there are sort of levels of complexity.
Yeah, it helps to think of it in 4 levels. First, the basic building blocks, nucleotides.
Okay.
Second, how these nucleotides link up linearly to form a strand.
A single chain.
Right. Third, for DNA, how 2 of these strands interact to form the famous double helix.
The spiral staircase.
And fourth, the complex 3-dimensional structure, how that helix folds, bends, and interacts with proteins to fit inside cells and form things like chromosomes.
Let's start with level 1 then. The nucleotide, the fundamental unit. What's it made of?
3 parts. You've got 1 or more phosphate groups, then a 5-carbon sugar, a pentose sugar, and finally, a nitrogenous base.
And the sugar is where DNA and RNA first differ, right?
Exactly. DNA has deoxyribose and RNA has diribose. The only difference is that the 2' carbon atom, ribose has a hydroxyl group, OH. Right?
And the oxyribose.
Is deoxy, it's missing that oxygen atom, which is just a hydrogen H there. Seems small, but that missing oxygen makes DNA much more stable, less prone to breaking down, better for long-term storage of information.
Okay, stability from the sugar. And the bases.
The nitrogenous bases, 2 types based on structure. The purines have a double ring structure, that's adenine A and guanine G.
A and G double rings.
And the pyrimidines have a single ring, cytosine C, thymine T, and uracil U.
Single ring, CTU.
And here's the other key difference between DNA and RNA bases. Thymine T is basically only found in DNA.
Right.
While uracil U is found only in RNA, where it essentially takes thymine's place in pairing. A, G, and C are in both.
So DNA uses A, T, C, G. RNA uses A, U, C, G, or G.
Got it. And you mentioned nucleosides versus nucleotides?
Ah, yes. Simple distinction. A nucleoside is just the sugar plus the base, like adenosine, adenine plus ribose.
A nucleotide is the nucleoside of +1, 2, or 3 phosphate groups attached to the sugar. So adenosine monophosphate, AMP, adenosine triphosphate, ATP, those are nucleotides. DATP would be the deoxy version for DNA.
So the phosphates make it a tide. Okay.
Yep.
How do these nucleotides link up to form that second level, the strand?
Through what's called a phosphodester linkage or bond. It's strong. Essentially, a phosphate group acts as a bridge, connecting the 5' carbon of one sugar to the 3' carbon of the next sugar in the chain.
5' to 3' connection.
Exactly. This creates a repeating backbone of sugar phosphate, and the bases, A, T, G, C, or U, stick out from this backbone.
Like charms on a bracelet.
That's a good analogy. And this backbone is negatively charged because of the phosphate groups. Critically, the way they link up gives the strand directionality. There's always a free phosphate group at one end, called the 5' end.
Of a start, kind of?
Yeah, the 5' end. And a free hydroxyl group on the sugar at the other end, the 3' end. And all the sugars point the same way. So we always read or write a DNA sequence from 5' to 3'.
And that linear sequence of bases is the actual code, right?
That's the information carrier. That sequence is incredibly stable, passed down through generations, only changing very rarely through mutation.
Okay, so we have the strand. Now the big one, the double helix. Level 3. This discovery story is legendary. Watson and Crick, 1953. But you said they built on others' work.
Oh, absolutely. It was a culmination. Linus Pauling was a huge influence. He had already figured out the alpha helix structure in proteins using physical models like ball and stick models.
So model building was key.
It was a powerful tool, but they needed actual data about DNA structure, and that came crucially from Rosalind Franklin and Maurice Wilkins.
X-ray diffraction.
Exactly. They were shooting X-rays through purified wet DNA fibers. Franklin especially obtained incredibly clear diffraction patterns.
What did her images reveal? The famous photo 51.
It showed several things very clearly. 1, the pattern strongly suggested a helical structure. 2, the dimensions indicated it was too wide to be just a single strand.
Ah, suggesting 2 strands.
Right. And 3, the pattern suggested there were about 10 base pairs fitting into each complete 360-degree turn of the helix. Critical pieces of the puzzle.
And there was another piece from biochemistry. Chargaff.
Yes, Irwin Chargaff. He was analyzing the amounts of each base, A, T, C, and G in DNA from lots of different species. And he found this consistent mathematical relationship.
Chargaff's rule.
That's it. The amount of adenine A always pretty much equaled the amount of thymine T. And the amount of guanine G always pretty much equaled the amount of cytosine C, ATGC.
That's uncanny. It just screams pairing.
It really does. It was a massive clue about how the bases might fit together within the helix.
So Watson and Crick had Pauling's approach, Franklin's X-ray data hinting at a 2-stranded helix with 10 units per turn, and Chargaff's ATGC rule. How did they synthesize all that?
They used model building, like Pauling. They tried different arrangements. Apparently, an early idea was pairing like A with A, T with T, but that didn't fit the width data from Franklin's X-rays.
It didn't work.
Nope. The breakthrough, the real aha moment, was realizing that adenine could form 2 stable hydrogen bonds specifically with thymine, and guanine could form 3 stable hydrogen bonds specifically with cytosine.
A with T, G with C.
Exactly. This AT and GC pairing fit Chargaff's rules perfectly, ATTGC. It also resulted in base pairs that had a consistent width, matching Franklin's data beautifully, and it explained how the 2 strands could be held together.
Hydrogen bonds, like tiny bits of molecular Velcro.
A good way to think of it. 2 bonds for AT, 3 for GC, it all clicked into place. An incredibly elegant structure.
And that led to the Nobel Prize for Watson, Crick, and Wilkins. Though it's important we remember Franklin's crucial contribution wasn't fully recognized at the time.
A really critical point, yes. Her data was absolutely essential to their model. It's a complex part of the history.
So let's summarize the key features of this amazing double helix structure.
Okay. You have 2 DNA strands twisted around a central axis, like that spiral staircase.
Right-handed twist, usually.
Usually, yes. That's called bDNA, the common form, stabilized by those hydrogen bonds between the complementary base pairs. A pairing with T, 2 H bonds, G pairing with C, 3 H bonds. This is the ATGC rule.
Which also means GC pairs are slightly stronger.
Correct. Regions rich in GC bonds require more energy to separate. And because of this specific pairing, the sequence of one strand dictates the sequence of the other. They are complementary.
If you have 5 ATTG3, the other must be 3 TOC5.
Precisely. And notice the directions they run opposite to each other. One strand goes 5' to 3', the other goes 3' to 5'. We call that anti-parallel.
Like lanes on a highway?
Exactly. Very important for how the DNA is read and copied. Dimension-wise, in bDNA, there are about 10 base pairs per turn. Each turn is about 3.4 nanometers long, so each base pair is stacked about 0.34 nanometers apart.
And the bases are stacked flat.
Yes, the flat purine and pyrimidine rings stack on top of each other, kind of like pancakes. This base stacking helps stabilize the helix, partly by pushing water molecules away.
And you mentioned grooves before, major and minor.
Yes. If you look at the outside surface of the helix, there are 2 indentations or grooves that spiral around. One is wider, the major groove, and one is narrower, the minor groove.
And why do these matter? You asked that earlier.
They matter hugely for protein interaction. The edges of the base pairs are more exposed in the grooves, especially the major groove.
So proteins can read the sequence there.
Exactly. Many proteins that need to recognize specific DNA sequences, like transcription factors that turn genes on or off, bind in the major groove where they can see the pattern of base pairs without unwinding the DNA.
Wow. And the minor groove.
Other proteins bind there, or sometimes proteins bind more generally to the DNA backbone, like histone proteins that package DNA. The grooves provide access points for interaction.
So the structure isn't just static, it's interactive.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned alternative forms like zDNA.
Right. BDNA is the classic right-handed helix, most common in cells. But under certain conditions like high salt or specific sequences like alternating purines and pyrimidines or even DNA modifications like methylation, the DNA can flip into a left-handed helix called zDNA.
Left-handed. That's different.
It is. It looks different too, more elongated and zigzagged with about 12 base pairs per turn.
Is it just a lab curiosity or does it happen in cells?
Evidence suggests it does form transiently in cells, perhaps playing roles in regulating gene activity or chromosome structure. It shows DNA isn't completely rigid. It has some conformational flexibility.
Fascinating. Okay, we've covered DNA structure pretty thoroughly. Let's switch gears to its cousin, RNA. How does its structure compare?
Well, RNA structure starts similarly. It's a polymer of nucleotides linked by phosphodiester bonds, just like a single DNA strand.
But with key differences.
Key differences, yes. 1, the sugar is ribose, not deoxyribose. 2, uracil replaces thymine T. 3, RNA is usually much shorter than DNA molecules. And 4, RNA is typically single-stranded.
But it's not just a floppy single strand, is it? You mentioned folding.
Exactly. While it's single-stranded, an RNA molecule can, and very often does, fold back on itself. Regions of the strand can form base pairs with other complementary regions on the same molecule.
Intramolecular base pairing.
Precisely. The AU and GC pairing rules still apply. This allows RNA to form complex three-dimensional shapes.
What kind of shapes?
You get common structural motifs like stem loops or hairpins, where the strand folds back on itself to form a short double helical stem capped by a loop of unpaired bases. You can also have bulge loops, internal loops, and more complex multi-branch junctions where several stem loops come together.
So it's the folding that gives RNA its function.
To a huge extent, yes. The specific 3D structure of an RNA molecule is often absolutely critical for its job. Think of transfer RNA, tRNA. It folds into a specific L shape that's essential for it to bind the right amino acid and recognize the right codon on the messenger RNA during translation.
Right, protein synthesis.
Or ribosomal RNA, rRNA. These molecules fold into incredibly complex structures that form the scaffold and even the active catalytic sites of the ribosome, the cell's protein-making machine.
Wait, catalytic sites? RNA can be an enzyme.
Yes, that was a Nobel Prize-winning discovery too. Some RNA molecules, called ribozymes, can catalyze chemical reactions, just like protein enzymes. Their specific 3D fold creates an active site. It highlights RNA's amazing versatility. It can carry information like DNA in some viruses and as mRNA, but it can also have complex structures and catalytic functions like proteins.
Wow, so RNA is really this dynamic, multi-talented molecule.
Definitely. A key player in bridging the gap between the DNA blueprint and the functional proteins of the cell.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what does this all mean? We've journeyed from Griffith's sick mice and the transforming principle
Through Avery's biochemical proof and Hershey and Chase's definitive blender experiment.
to the elegant double helix structure deduced from Franklin's X-rays, Chargaff's rules, and Watson and Crick's model building. And finally, the versatile structures of RNA.
It's quite a path.
It really is.
Yeah.
And understanding these structures, DNA and RNA, it's not just, trivia. It's fundamental to understanding how life works, how information is stored, copied, passed on, and used.
It underpins basically all of modern biology and medicine.
Absolutely. It's the language of life itself.
Which does raise a really interesting question for the future, doesn't it? We understand these structures now in incredible detail, but given their precision, their stability, yet also their potential for dynamic changes like zDNA or RNA folding, what else might they be doing?
What subtle functions are we still missing?
Exactly. As we look deeper into how these molecules interact, how they're modified, what other forms they might take inside the living cell, are there astonishing new roles waiting to be discovered, especially as we get better at manipulating them with things like CRISPR.
A really provocative thought to end on the story might be far from over. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the blueprint of life. We really hope you had some of those aha moments with us.
It's been great exploring it.
Thank you for being part of the Deep Dive family. Keep asking questions. Keep exploring.